The four of us enjoyed some resemblance of a normal dinner that first full day, all things considered. Steak and baked potatoes off the grill never tasted better. We even enjoyed music that was downloaded on my now non-internet working Android phone. After dinner, we threw a few games of darts in my place with the help of some well-illuminated candles and lanterns. The temperature in my apartment had plummeted to a now crisp 57 degrees in just 27 hours since the electrical power grid crashed and ceased to function. The mercury thermometer on my balcony was reading a frosty, bitter 19 degrees Fahrenheit, an abnormally chilly start to what was not even technically our winter season yet, which officially wouldn't begin for another 8 days. I had no intention on breaking out and using my Mr. Buddy heaters just yet. I didn't have an infinite and endless supply of propane, even with the additional canisters I acquired today. I told Jim we would need to ration our reserves until the temps were so unbearable in our units we needed them to help fight off frostbite and the prospect of freezing to death in our sleep. Spring was well over 3 months away. It was going to be a long, harsh, ruthless, and cruel winter. All the food, water, and ammunition wouldn't help us survive sub-zero polar temperatures. If dehydration, hunger, or a world gone mad didn't kill you, the bitter, brutal, and unrelenting Western New York winter would. My 3-person tent was now up and fully operational in the middle of my living room floor, chock full of every blanket I owned, including the prepper staple supply of wool blankets. Jim and Jody heeded my advice and did the same in their place. They were fortunate enough to have the luxury of enjoying each other's body heat on top of their blankets. Armageddon or not, there was no way I was entertaining that option with Brian inside of mine. Besides, I had instructed that we always have someone on overnight security duty while the other 3 tried to recharge and rejuvenate their bodies with sleep. We had bolstered and reinforced our entry points the best we could. Brian was taking the first night's shift of guarding and protecting our safety. He would set up shop in the dark shadows of the hallway downstairs, armed with 50 rounds of buckshot in the Maverick 88. He would easily see anyone approaching under the irradiating light of the winter's moon, reflecting off the snowpack before they would ever notice his silhouette lurking in the jet-black darkness of our building. You could never underestimate what the proper preparedness and the element of surprise could do to help with your chance of survival in doomsday. At 1800 hours, I had kept my promise and made my daily contact with Blake. Before I could share my intel from our near-deadly shopping experience with him, he said one of his sources that was on the ground yesterday when D.C. completely fell into a frenzy and battleground had made their way back home local to us. He continued telling me it was utter madness. The left and right were going to war with each other in the streets, and both sides were battling authoritative forces of police and military. When the CME struck, it only added fuel to the fire, and the environment quickly descended into further disarray. With the sheer volume of numbers on both sides that had congregated at our nation's capital, he guessed that without the United States military deploying drone strikes on its own civilians, there was no way they were going to be able to terminate the violence, slaughter, and conflict post-CME. This just reinforced to me that with armed forces already stretched thin trying to quell a potential civil war from spreading further out around the Washington, D.C. area, that we were going to be on our own from the cataclysmic and devastating national power failure. My treacherous supply run intelligence paled in comparison to what Blake shared with me. But what had played out and transpired was local to us. The madness and insanity that he dispensed was almost 400 miles away. The reckoning and final days were quite possibly upon us in the year that was 2020. I had often fantasized about a post-societal collapse. Most preppers, I'm sure, had as well too. The fall of a complex human society, the loss of cultural identity and socioeconomic complexity, the downfall of government, and the vicious rise of violence, It's what we prepared for. What many spent years acquiring knowledge, goods, skills, and supplies to hopefully help their loved ones and themselves survive. Many had prophesied the cause would be from a natural disaster or an unspeakable plague, or would revert to a more primitive state. Virtually all civilizations have suffered this fate regardless of size or complexity. Some had revived and transformed, while others never recovered and completely disappeared. Fantasy had now turned into a grim, ghastly reality. The stress, fear, and anxiety of a Biden administration dwindled in comparison to what 330 million U.S. residents were about to suffer through. Daydreaming about a Mad Max total meltdown is now a real-life nightmare, I thought to myself. Life has just become nasty, deadly, ugly, dire, and daunting. Lots of my loved ones will ultimately perish. I'm going to have to make difficult decisions that while I'm hopeful I'm prepared to make them, I don't really want to. It's crucial you are mentally wargaming possible scenarios. If you do not, think about certain situations and mentally envision what your reaction to those situations are. You're doing yourself a great disservice. Daydreaming involves some measure of an enjoyment. This nightmare scenario involves disease, starvation, pain, agony, and the stern reality that many will die a miserable death. I didn't sleep much last night as my mind continued racing through every possible harrowing and horrifying storyline I could imagine. It looked like tonight would be more of the same. I'd radio down to Brian in what I felt like was every 30 minutes or so and ask for an update. His answer was, the same as it was 5 minutes ago when you last asked. Why don't you go to bed? He'd question at the end of each communication. It's amazing how slow time travels during the darkness of the night. These first few night times were most likely the most important times to sleep, for the foreseeable days, nights, and weeks ahead would be surely filled with much trouble and turmoil. The remaining hours, minutes, and seconds sluggishly ticked away in what was ultimately and thankfully an uneventful second night. Jim and Jody awoke before me and discovered that less than 40 hours after the world would be forever changed, that the taps went dry and ceased to produce fresh water. The one thing that civilization most likely took for granted was now gone. Vital pumps dependent on electricity were now disabled. No water to drink, no water for sanitation, and even more worrisome, no water for municipal fire departments to help extinguish raging neighborhood infernos. Once manageable house fires are now free to spread and decimate city blocks. The destruction of the country's electrical system is creating havoc in many ways the average person never imagined. People who are residents on 50th floor penthouses will now have to resort to hiking the equivalent of a 500-foot cliff to obtain drinking water without the use of an elevator. Those city dwellers now have a life expectancy of 0, living in high-rise death traps. We were fortunate enough to have a few hundred gallons of water set aside, enough to last us through winter until outdoor water sources would begin to thaw. The wellness checks the emergency alert had promised by municipal and state police never happened yesterday, almost certainly creating more panic for Americans who heard the message. Hundreds of millions unprepared, unfit, and unready to survive a long-term grid-down scenario, hoping and praying the government would bail them out like they did with the paltry and scant stimulus checks during the height of COVID. Today would be Brian's first missed dialysis appointment. I was concerned for how his body and mental state would react as the number of those missed visits would continue to grow. How long before he could no longer be a contributing member of our apocalyptic squad? He had volunteered for last night's security detail. He told the three of us he didn't know how long he'd be here for, but for the time being, he was going to do as much as possible for us. The four of us gathered in my place for morning breakfast and to discuss the day's agenda. Pancakes, bacon, and eggs on the propane-powered Coleman Camp cooktop. The three of them would have to adjust to Insta-coffee. Even though I had never so much as tasted coffee in my 42 years on Earth, I did stock and store it. I figured it'd be a valuable trade and barter item post-collapse. Tens of millions of Americans suffered from addictions to drugs and alcohol. Add to that, hundreds of millions more who had vices for caffeine and nicotine. With civilization completely collapsing, just imagine how many people would be suffering from some sort of withdrawal. Many of the hardcore drug-dependent users would most likely head to hospitals and pharmacies, hoping to feed their fix. How fast and hard would the average Joe crumble without their morning cup of coffee and smoke? People's mental health was about to be tested like never before. For those who had a grueling, grinding, and laborious time surviving the initial COVID lockdowns, how would they ever live and pull through Armageddon? Depression and suicide had already seen a dramatic increase over the past 9 months. How many, after a week or two of no water, no electricity, no poison to pump in their body, and no hope, would ultimately decide to off themselves? Deep, dark thoughts constantly raced through my mind of this perpetually transformed world. Jim startled me as he put his hand on my shoulder, saying I was burning the pancakes as my mind was occupied by the nightmares and madness I imagined playing out. The three of them sat at my kitchen table enjoying a warm, hot breakfast as I stared out my sliding glass door into the abysmal white winter wonderland outside, always scanning, being watchful of what was materializing beyond the safety and security of our building. Jody asked sarcastically, "What do you think's going to happen? You think someone's going to come rushing and breach our doors?" Without even turning my head to make eye contact, I answered vigorously, "I don't think. I know eventually someone or some group will show up hungry, despondent, and desperate, and do whatever they have to try and take what we have, Jody. I'll be ready to defend, preserve, and protect you, Jim, Brian, and all that we have with deadly lethal force. I only hope you will do the same when that day comes." The grim reality led to the remainder of breakfast to be ate in silence, until Jim spoke up saying he wanted to venture the 1.5 miles down the street in the opposite direction of Food Town to the independent senior center he worked at. It was a 65 and older community covering 3 floors and over 100 seniors. He genuinely cared for those residents. Not only was he the head of maintenance, but he was their source of entertainment. He often put on weekly concerts playing the keyboard or his beloved ukulele, singing off key with his pitchy voice. It didn't matter though, most were hard of hearing and just enjoyed his energy and the smile on his face. During the height of COVID, when the building was in complete lockdown from family visits, it was Jim who showed up on his own time at night to play euchre and gin rummy with them, often lifting their spirits and quite possibly saving them from depression or even death. I would often joke with him saying he was trying to work his way into their wills, but truthfully, that was Jim, going above and beyond to care for them and help bring some resemblance of normal to their lives during the COVID-19 outbreak. As much as I wanted to say no to Jim's adventure, I knew I couldn't. Those were his friends, his family, and he wanted and needed to make sure they were okay. Jim said the building is equipped with backup generators with enough fuel to keep power running for 4 to 5 days. He and I were both hopeful that any residents with a family local may eventually show up and relocate their loved ones. A building that still has lights and power running currently would also be a target for the unprepared to take up occupancy at. He could be walking into a senior center full of vagrants and drifters who could easily overpower and take advantage of people 2 to 3 times their age. Jim asked Brian if he could borrow his wheels and make the short trek in his 4-wheel drive truck, seeing as the roads were still impassable for most cars. Brian answered, "I'll do you one better and drive you there." Shocked by his response, I said, "Are you sure? You just pulled a full night of security detail and haven't slept a wink." He responded in a somber tone, "I'm not sure how long I'll be here for you guys, so I'm going to do whatever I can for the time being. I'll sleep when I'm dead. Besides, we're only going 1.5 miles down the road, and we'll be in constant communications on the 2-way radios. You stay here with Jody and man the fort, and Jim and I will check in on his residence." "All right," I said. "It's settled. Let's gather some gear and get you 2 on the road. Just in case the worst case scenario happens, I want you guys to have some food and other essential supplies in case shit goes sideways." The Maverick 88 Brian carried had 5 in the tube, 5 on the side saddle, and 50 rounds on the bandolier strapped across his shoulder and body. I included in the bag of supplies a few boxes of 7.62 by 39 for the Yugoslavian SKS Jim carried, along with 40 rounds of 9mm for the 2 magazines I'd given with the Glock 19. At 9:47 a.m., the 2 of them walked out of the security of our building into 22-degree temps with a now intense snowband moving in and dropping heavy, thick, dense snowflakes.